You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about Amityville 3D with guest Josh Spiegel. Here we go. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau, and we also have returning guest Josh Spiegel. Josh is the author of Timelines of Terror, The Fractured Continuities of Horror Film Sequels, published by McFarlane Press. The book examines horror films, the sequels, the glue that holds these franchises together, talking franchises like Friday the 13th, Halloween, Child's Play, Nightmare on Elm Street, Leprechaun, and certainly Amityville, which is going to be a topic because today we're talking about Amityville 3D. That's right, the 3D installment in the Amityville franchise. And on a previous episode, Josh came on to talk about the so many Amityville movies that are out there. But if you want to hear about that, you can listen to that episode and check out Josh's YouTube channel, Movie Timelines, where he goes over the different movie timelines from these horror franchises, but also other movie franchises. And he also has the 80s Project, a project where he's going through every 80s horror movie, talking about it, its impact on horror, and uncovering some forgotten gems. And arguably one of those gems could be Amityville 3. So let's talk about it.
In this house, after all these years, the terror still grows. Now, it takes on a new dimension.
Get out! Everybody get out of the house!
Amityville 3D, rated PG.
Oh God, Amityville 3.
All right, here we go. I've got some notes on Amityville just for context. And Josh, that's one thing that I'm a big fan of, is just kind of figuring out how we got there. Because I like to get a sense, like, what happened? How did we get to this movie? And for folks that are not familiar, on Long Island, New York in 1974, Pete, were you born?
I was 2 years old. So
2 years old.
I was born.
A young Pete Charbonneau was on Long Island in 1974, where, sorry, Pete, the next part is not going to be as much fun. So 2-year-old, earmuffs, please. Ronald DeFeo killed his family and was convicted a year later on 6 counts of murder. DeFeo pleaded not guilty, reason of insanity, claiming he'd heard voices and that on the night of the murders, something made him, got him out of control and he killed his family. Jury didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 6 life sentences. A month after the conviction, Lutz family moves into the old DeFeo house. And then you get the iconic 3-story colonial located at 112 Ocean Avenue with maybe the most memorable windows in film history. Less than a month later, Lutz leave the house, claiming it was haunted. They mention cold spots, green slime on the floor, the wife being transformed into like a 90-year-old woman. She was levitating, beds being slammed up and down, a demonic voice saying, "Get out." 1977, Lutz's partner with writer Jay Anson, and he writes The Amityville Horror, a True Story, released in 1976.
My family moved into their new home in Amityville, Long Island. It ended 28 days later when they fled the house in terror. During that time, they endured a nightmare of evil, a plague of unnatural, inexplicable, and horrifying events, which began when their 5-year-old daughter boasted of a sinister new playmate. The Amityville Horror, more terrifying than The Exorcist, because it actually happened. Read it now in Pan paperback.
And then in 1979, movies released starring James Brolin, Margot Kidder, Rod Steiger. What comes out in 1979? Kramer vs. Kramer, Superman 2, Moonraker, Alien, Apocalypse Now, Mad Max, and if you can dig it, The Warriors. And that brings us to Amityville 3, because of course the movie does incredibly well. It makes over $80 million on a budget of under $5, one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. It was only superseded, guys, in 1990 by TMNT. So the only connection between the Amityville and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, maybe. One of the highest grossing horror films in movie history at the time, as of the late 70s. So, of course, right, the producers make Amityville, does great. They make a sequel. Amityville 2, The Possession in 82, replaced the DeFeos with the Montellis. That makes over $12 million on a budget of $5. which brings us to the third film in the franchise, Amityville 3D. 2-year-old Pete Charbonneau watching eventually maybe in like a wood paneled basement, Amityville 1 or 2 or 3, Pete?
Sure. Yeah. Amityville and Amityville 2 were definitely video rentals and cable watches for me. The Amityville 2 used to scare the shit out of me when the Ronald DeFeo stand-in becomes possessed and then like basically hunts down his family. Still to this day, it's kind of, creepy. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in that movie, brother and sister. And it's like a nasty, it's got like a weird bent to it. I think it was like, you might know this better than me, Josh, but directed by Damiano Damiani, an Italian director. So like bringing maybe a little bit of giallo sense to it. Yeah, I was certainly fascinated by the whole story, being a young teen growing up on Long Island at that time. I kind of I read the Amityville Horror. I read one of the sequel books. I read High Hopes, which is basically about the original murders when Butch DeFeo would come up for parole. That would usually make a big spread in Newsday, which was the local daily paper on Long Island. So like I was fascinated by the whole story. Was the Amityville Horror hoax? Was it real? This is back in the 70s and 80s when you could still plausibly think that, maybe this did happen. And you'd hear the stories of how the Lutzes concocted the story with their lawyer over a couple of bottles of wine and, certain...
Wait, you're saying it's not real?
Allegedly, Josh. Allegedly. It's allegedly.
It's as real as that Tito's vodka in your videos, Josh. We'll say
that's
that.
Right. Yes. They were drinking non-alcoholic wine when they concocted the story. So when Amityville 3 came out, I was certainly kind of jonesing to see it in the theater. I did not see it in the theater. I remember this would be my last little aside anecdote, and then we can knock on with the actual movie, but girl that I had a huge crush on. I remember announcing the weekend that it opened that she was going on a date to see it. And I wanted so badly to be that person on that date to see Amityville 3 with her. I was not. But I think, on balance, I think I may have lucked out, not because of her, but because of the film. Like, I don't know if I was in the theater, that might have put me off, any number of horror genres going forward because, this is an interesting one.
Josh, you've talked about the Amity films on your YouTube show, Movie Timelines. Do you have a recollection when you may have seen, I'll spot you, Amityville 1, 2, or 3 for the first time?
I don't know if I could say it for the first time, but I definitely remember watching, in particular, Amityville 3D a lot on cable when I was younger. I know I'd seen the first one before I'd seen the third one, and I've never really cared that much for the first movie. I still think it's one of the weaker ones. The second one, I know that I saw on cable when I was younger, and I adore the second one. The second one is my favorite of the entire, out of anything that has the word Amityville on it, except maybe the last Amityville movie. I think it's my absolute favorite of any of them. It's so fun and ridiculous. And Amityville 3, I remember watching probably repeatedly on cable when it was on, because then they would do those bizarre, like, Friday night at 8, go down to the 7-Eleven and get your 3D glasses, and we're going to do a special airing of Amityville 3D and 3D. And just watching it with those weird little plastic glasses with 7-Eleven on the side, like watching that swordfish fly at you and everything like that. Like, I definitely have very strong memories of that. More so, out of all of the Amityville movies, I think when I was younger, Amityville 3D is probably the one I had seen repeatedly, just because they had it on cable so much.
There's something too about Amityville 3D where it's like in this cross section between the Amityville movies in general. They're a haunted house movie, right? So they kind of lean into that genre. They're also part of the unexplained supernatural genre. So I think it, for people who as much believe in the supernatural, and then as many people who are skeptics who maybe are watching it with disbelief, to discredit, because they want to explain through like rational terms, like what's happening, like, oh no, that's not actually what could have happened. It's a possession movie. And maybe in this case, it's, more of the house being possessed instead of someone being possessed, but it also has some of those elements. And then you also get some of that, like based on a real story where, especially now where we have like a society that's almost created like its own genre in true crime, where there's something about exploiting like real life events, and some of them, more macabre or morbid, and then translating that into like a form of entertainment. So there's something about Amityville that like checks all those boxes. And then you get Amityville 3D. Hey, in the same year that Space Hunter, Treasure of the Four Crowns, and Jaws 3D too, then let's also release Amityville 3D, because that maybe will get asses in the seats. So I don't blame them for doing it. Makes sense.
Very quick interjection, because it is very important, is it is not Amityville 3. It is Amityville 3D. And it is important because it is not the third part of the Amityville saga. It is literally supposed to just be Amityville 3D. And
Absolutely.
If you take that 3D away, theoretically, it's supposed to just be the movie. The title of the movie is supposed to just be Amityville, but it's in 3D.
And isn't that due in part to like Dino De Laurentiis? I guess there was like a lawsuit between the Lutz family and De Laurentiis where they wanted it to be very delineated. This has nothing to do with them. This is not a sequel to 1 or 2. This is its own thing.
Yeah, De Laurentiis and the Lutzes had a big back and forth, and there was a lot of like issues with that. And there was also arguments with Jay Anson, because again, Jay Anson, the guy that wrote the Amityville book with the Lutzes, obviously wanted any Amityville sequels to just be continuations of the books that he wrote, which were about the Lutzes and everything like that. Whereas obviously they went in a different direction. And, the next movie was supposed to be sort of the Feos, and this third movie had nothing to do with that. So there was lawsuits and issues with that, and they didn't want to be tied into it. Because of a lawsuit, Dino De Laurentiis wasn't allowed to present the movie as a sequel to the Amityville horror. So on the poster itself, if you look at the poster, it says, this picture is not a sequel to the pictures The Amityville Horror and The Amityville Horror 2. So Amityville 3D is theoretically the first illegitimate sequel in this franchise of just like, we're just going to put a movie out and call it Amityville, whatever, and that's exactly it. So instead of it being Amityville Part 3, which was also in 3D like Jaws was, this was supposed to be Amityville, a solo film just called Amityville, that is also in 3D. Really weird story.
I was going to say, and to muddle the waters a little bit more, or to blur the windows a little bit to kind of stay in tone here. Wasn't it also released as like Amityville the Demon when it was on broadcast TV? Because there is no 3D, unless, like you mentioned, Josh, you had some folks that were promoting it that way. Pete and I have this recollection of watching Revenge of the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and it must have been around like 85, because I remember watching it in my neck of the woods as a Svengoolie promotion. He's a horror host from the Midwest, and he's become more popular. He's more national now than he certainly was in 85 when I saw it. But I remember asking my parents, we've got to get the 3D glasses so I can watch Revenge of the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and be utterly disappointed, but it's still in 3D. So I got to watch this. And some of the movies that you've talked about, Pete, watching on Pix in your neck of the woods on Long Island, where it seems like they had similar promotions to what Josh saw. But then for folks who didn't see that, they saw Amityville the Demon, or was it Amityville 3 the Demon?
Not in the US. It was called Amityville 3 the Demon in foreign markets overseas. Okay. Here it was called Amityville. It was always called Amityville 3D, and that actually caused some big issues, because they would even release, when they put it on VHS and the VHS copies were not in 3D, it was still called Amityville 3D, because that was part of the title. So that became an issue, and they actually had to like smooth things over with people, and like all the future releases had to clarify that. Yeah, Amityville 3 the Demon was what they called it in overseas releases and things, where the copyright laws are a little jankier.
You can see all the little asterisks next to the title. This has nothing to do with part 1. Also nothing to do with part 2, The Possession. Also nothing to do with Lutz. Also nothing to do with the book. Also not in 3D. Enjoy your experience. Please enjoy.
There may or may not be a demon in it if you watch it.
Yes. Well, maybe for like 10 seconds, Pete. Spoiler.
Yeah. Just stay to the end, please. Please stay to the end.
That's right.
And wasn't this one rated PG as well?
In my recollection, Pete, I don't think there was enough that would have probably warranted it to be a PG-13, because I feel like, again, you get a lot of the, things are a little scary, but never overly scary. And even at the end, when you get the guy who gets acid in the face, sometimes it almost plays comedic, especially having seen it now. But, it doesn't come off as overly gruesome or gory. It feels a little bit more like that Gremlins, Monster Squad, where you're just like, oh, this is okay. Like a kid could watch this and they won't be traumatized. They might be bored more than they will be traumatized.
It was also 83, which was pre PG-13. So
there we go.
It was either going to be G, PG, or R.
I'm guessing a lot of kids were probably big Tony Roberts fans, went to go see this in the theater.
Yeah, they were watching all his Woody Allen films, and they're like, "Mom, I want to go see this."
It might have been better if Tony Robbins was the star of this. He might have been able to motivate producers and the house and the demon to come up with a better film.
You got Tess Harper, Meg Ryan, Lori Loughlin. Even though it has no connection to the other films, it certainly has the name, and it's been some time since I've seen this, especially in our rewatch of these 80s 3D films. It has all of the tropes that you would expect. The scene where the guy's drinking from a straw and he blows the straw cover to the camera, and towards the end of the film where it basically just turns into Poltergeist, and they have a crew that are there. They're shoving microphones and camera equipment at the screen, all the stuff that we've seen from Treasure of the Four Crowns with spears and turkey vultures thrown on the screen, or Coming at You, where it's bullets and flaming arrows. This kind of checks the boxes in being as much of a movie as sometimes it is a gimmick.
Yeah, and it does have the special effects that seemed like it was outtakes from watching Land of the Lost as a kid as well, with the floating spirit at the end. But I mean, it does still have the house, which I believe was not the actual Amityville house, but there was a house, I believe it was in Toms River, New Jersey, that was used for the first 3, or maybe in Connecticut, I think, or maybe both. I can't remember. Josh may know more about that. I'm fading in my Amityville expertise in my old age, but
you've actually seen the house, Pete. You've seen it in person.
I have seen the house. Yes, I have seen the house without the windows, because they had those removed to deter people from coming by, but people still come by.
They utilized the same house in Toms River, New Jersey, for all the exteriors, but all of the interiors were on a soundstage.
And they took advantage of that house, right? Because I mean, that is as much as part of what Amityville has evolved or turned into, where we've talked about where Amity films have become more comedic in tone, more outlandish. They've doubling down on just moving completely away from what the original was, let alone what the 3D version is. But that's where I think there's something about this film that fits perfectly in that, yes, the stuff that you talk about, Josh, on your YouTube show, it's part of a franchise, and there are links there, even if some of them are a little bit loose, but they do kind of still lean into a lot of the reoccurring themes that come up in those Amity films, that whether it's canon, whether it's not, it's still part of the Amityville timeline, part of that series.
It feels very much a part of the ones that have come before, even though there's no story elements that link it. Although there is one distinct element that feels very much it. But the demon that shows up in the well at the ending to drag the guy's name Elliot, the character's name is Elliot, down into the well, that is the same demon that shows up at the ending of Amityville 2. If it's not the same mask, it's a very similar mask. So that kind of links them together. And I don't know if I don't know if they used the same exact design, or if it's just somebody said, "Well, make it look like that one." But yeah, it's so that's probably outside of the thematic elements of there's the house, and obviously the flies, because there's always the flies in those ones. That was kind of it. And they do mention that they talk about the DeFeos a bit here and there, but
doesn't the house blow up at the end of 2 and 3? That's like, it's almost like the Jaws 3D effect of like, how do we end this thing with a bang? So you blow up the shark in 1, you electrocute in 2, blow it up again in 3, and then Amityville. Let's just blow up the house a couple of times.
Mm-hmm. Well, it gets a little damaged in 2, nothing to the point of there's no coming back from this. But in part 3, yes, the house gets leveled, like just completely destroyed. So to the point where when they make Amityville 4, it's kind of like, oh, it's just back. The house is back. That's the one where it's weird.
I did catch, not to go way off of Amityville 3, but I did catch like 5 or 10 minutes of Amityville in space, and I think the house there just uproots itself from its foundation and launches itself into space. So again, like this is a very versatile house.
Yeah, it's been around the block. No pun.
Been around the orbit, Josh.
It's been around the universe.
Been around the development. Been around, yeah.
I'm surprised that, with the marketing campaign that came out for Barbie, where they even had like an HGTV show where they were building a Barbie house. How has there not been a Shudder TV, HGTV type show where they're renovating an Amityville house type thing? And of course, like hilarity would ensue, but so would scary as shit. So I mean, there's a way where you could have that found footage approach, but also still throw the Amityville on, and it would actually work in the tone of the show, because this house has gone through so much. But the painting of the clown, the clock, the mirror, you throw that all in there, and it's like, whoa, are you starting to like lean into the mythology? Are you trying to make this canon?
Kind of glorious about part 3 as well, too, is that part 3 is sort of tied into those real life events once again. Because, the movie Amityville 3D is about a guy who is a skeptic, and he's in the house busting people that are pulling hoaxes. And then he gets convinced to buy the house himself, and he moves in. Of course, he finds out that the house actually is haunted. That entire thing was based on an actual guy named Stephen Kaplan, I want to say. And he was a guy that was a paranormal investigator back in the day, but he was a paranormal investigator who was very interested in, like, I want to find the supernatural, but before I find the supernatural, I'm going to prove that it's not faked. And he and the Lutzes had discussions and back and forth. And I guess that he was supposed to come in and check out the house. But then at the last minute, George Lutz was like, no.
Because he was trying to discredit them, right? Like their story and what kind of like motivated the book, right?
Right. And so they had a rather public back and forth. The movie was sort of made as a dig on that. I don't know if it was supposed to be sort of like busting Kaplan's chops or not. I'm just like, yeah, but if you did come to the house, you'd see it's real. Or if it was just kind of like playing into all of that. But either way, it's kind of funny, because it's like, in real life, the guy would have moved into the house and been like everybody else to moved into the house and said, yeah, there's nothing, everything's normal.
Which kind of leans into like the plot, right? Because if they're working off the accounts of this paranormal investigator, Stephen Kaplan, and then you have Tony Roberts, who's also playing a supernatural debunker in the movie, and then comes in to a psychic couple trying to kind of like out them for maybe taking advantage of other people, and then inevitably also being the very couple, he and his girlfriend, who end up moving into the Amityville house. And yet when things happen that seem to be unexplained, he's dismissive of them. And maybe that's as much leaning into his character as a skeptic, but also, maybe giving the audience someone that's like, hey, look, this is so unbelievable that our character is kind of like the audience surrogate. Like, of course, none of this could happen. There's no way. But oh my God, once it starts happening, it starts dialing it up. And like you said, has to go beyond flies, because now it's part 3. So now you're going to have to get some prosthetics and slime and ooze and in a fog machine.
Yeah. Well, and it's also one of the earlier examples of a phenomenon that I happen to like quite a bit, which is the haha silly skeptic phenomena, which happens in horror movies. And it's just like so many horror movies revolve around a skeptic who disproves supernatural things going into a haunted place to disprove it and then finding out that it's real. And this whole genre, I think, truly appeals to the people out there that want to say, ha ha, silly skeptic, because they're so used to, in real life, these skeptics going into these supposedly haunted places and being like, yep, it's not haunted. So it's kind of like in the fictional world, it's like, oh, we can finally see in the fictional world, it can be, you find out that it's haunted. So it's just kind of like a nice cathartic moment that they never get in real life of seeing the skeptic be proven wrong.
I did like the opening scene where they break up the, the con that's going on. You got like the guy in like the black bodysuit, like scooped across the room, holding like the glowing orb on a stick. Yeah. So
hashtag not my American Ninja, but please continue.
It was not Michael Dudikoff.
He was not.
Well, and it's funny because I always do wonder if that scene is sort of a subtle dig at the Lutzes in a way. I don't know if it is or not, but it kind of feels like it is. It's like, oh, we're going into this house and there's these charlatans here. Mm-hmm. They're trying to prove they're faking the haunting. Like, I always wonder if, even though I feel like the movie is in a way kind of busting Stephen Kaplan's chops, and
sure,
but is it also busting the Lutz's chops? I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about, but I don't know.
I think it all adds up to Dino De Laurentiis just wanting to make some money, Josh. That's probably what it is.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
And did it? Like, I remember this one kind of bombing at the theater. I think it kind of killed the franchise for a good 5 to 7 years, right?
Yes, it was a big bomb. It debuted at number 1, but it only had a 2.3 million opening weekend, which was fairly soft at that particular time. It was it came out on the same weekend as A Christmas Story. And even though it beat it on the opening weekend, A Christmas Story would keep going up and up and up with each week after its release, whereas Amityville 3D would just drop. And it only made $6 million in its entire run, and it cost $6 million to make. So even though it theoretically made back its budget, they marked it off as the ending of the franchise until a few years later when somebody decided a TV movie would be a perfect thing to do.
Yep. And you figure they hit it hot and heavy because the first one is 79, second one, The Possession, is 82, 3D is in 83, and then like you said, Josh, it's not until, is it 89 that you get that TV movie Amityville: The Evil Escapes.
Premier thriller.
It was supposed to be their dream house.
A new environment.
But something moved in with them.
I saw Daddy last night.
A single mother.
She talks as if her father is still alive.
Is about to fight an evil.
It all seems so crazy.
She doesn't understand.
Lock that attic door. Are you crazy?
America's most dangerous house. Could be the last place Patty Duke and Jane Wyatt lived.
God.
Presenting a world premiere thriller. An all-new Amityville: The Evil Escapes. Next.
I have to imagine, too, that foreign distributors, just like Jaws, right? Like we were talking about the making of Jaws 3D, and, they tried to approach it as a parody, bringing in, National Lampoon writers to basically make Jaws 3 People Zero.
I'm so sad it never was an actual thing. Like, I was
same
ill to have seen that version.
Jaws 2 does well enough because even though it's not remembered as fondly as the first one, you have to still have foreign distributors at the time. You still had drive-ins, people that could say, hey, I can fill in seats if you put Jaws in the title. So a studio would kind of be dumb not to at least pursue or explore making a third one. You have to kind of bring the same logic to Amityville. Why not continue the franchise, whichever way it's going to go. And certainly with Amityville, it's gone all over the place.
A lot of ways.
Like, a lot of different ways. Yeah. Why not keep making it? Because I'm sure, somewhere in Italy, somewhere in the UK, this movie comes out and it's either a movie that's just called Evil Escapes, or someone sees Amityville: The Evil Escapes. So in this case, it would be on broadcast TV. But you're like, hey, must be part of that series. I caught the first one. It was okay. Maybe I'll check this out. And you're just trying to create that shorthand for someone to give you 90 minutes of their time. It's as much marketing as it is distribution, as it is business. It kind of makes sense.
Well, yeah. I mean, especially once you get that name. I mean, once anything hits name recognition and it becomes a brand. And in this particular case, you have a brand that you can't necessarily copyright. That's what makes it interesting.
I also find it interesting, like after the fourth one, which was titled Amityville 4: The Evil Escapes, they just decided to do away with numbers. Like, well, we're just, a lot of colons, a lot of the Amityville colon.
Well, and keep in mind too, again, a lot of those early ones, even like going as back as Amityville Dollhouse and things like that, a lot of those were made by different studios. This has never been a legitimate franchise of like that. That's why a lot of them didn't have the numbers, because it wasn't like they were getting express permission from some specific studio, because no studio had the official rights to do everything Amityville. So that's why when you look at who released a lot of those early ones, it's usually some different companies.
That's why I appreciate on your show, Josh, where you kind of tried to bring some sense of like structure or a timeline to these. I mean, hey, movie timelines, that's the show.
Yes, but not the easiest of things to try to do.
No, but like you're looking at every corner of the screen to find something that will anchor when that movie is taking place. And in some of the videos, like, that the film doesn't say anything to necessarily say, hey, this is 1980 something or 2000 something. So you're looking for context clues. License plates, things on whiteboards, newspapers, like that. That's what you're looking for to try to anchor this. And that's what makes maybe Amityville that much harder. Sometimes they reference the DeFeo, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're completely ridiculous. Sometimes they reference pieces that were in the house, like whether it's lumber or the clock or the mirror or whatever. So you're piecing together a canon of sorts to say, well, this kind of would fall in place here, and maybe it's in its own timeline with these other movies because they were made by the same filmmaker, and maybe not, but at least you did an attempt of putting together a structure.
Yeah, I mean, and again, with the whole Amityville series, you have to kind of go into it with two different minds as well, too, because not only are you trying to figure out where it belongs in this continuity of things, but you have to try to find some element of continuity. And some of the movies just don't have it, because again, like I mentioned with Amityville Cop, where it was never intended to be Amityville anything. But then, there is other ones like Amityville Coven, which wasn't originally intended to be an Amityville movie, but they decided on making it one during the process of filming. So they added lines of dialogue to tie it in together. So you have instances like that where, they mentioned the DeFeos and there's a guy named DeFeo and things like that where it becomes a thing. And so looking for those kind of things becomes a whole nother game of like, okay, well, how can this tie into these other movies, if at all?
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
Have you found any other kindred spirits, Josh, like you? I mean, you've done a deep dive into a lot of different franchises, a lot of different series. Have you found someone like you that maybe is hardcore for one series, confirming everything you found, or maybe on the opposite, just being like, hey, you got a few things wrong, let me correct you?
Sadly, I don't really have a lot of people to talk about this kind of stuff with. And
is that why you talk to the camera, Josh?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it's true. I mean, honestly, I spend most of my days talking to either a computer screen or a 6-year-old. So that's most of my time is spent in conversations with that. My wife doesn't want to sit down and talk Amityville stuff with me, and that's for sure. But yeah, I really feel like generally I've never sat down with somebody that has been like, I have also done a deep dive on this. Let's discuss this kind of stuff. And I feel like
check your math and see like if you're like, hey, did I miss something or did you catch something they didn't?
Even with a lot of the other things, occasionally people will say like, oh, hey, what about this or whatever. But I always try to remind things. It's just like, look, it's like all of this is open to interpretation. And a lot of times where there's inconsistent things where you've got this date but doesn't match up with this, it's like I've got to make a judgment call. And I've had people tell me, well, I don't really, I know, especially with the Friday the 13th, I've had people like disagree with some of my placements. It's like, well, I just don't feel as if it could be in that time frame because look at this close or whatever like that. And I was like, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, that was my guess. It doesn't have to be right. Some people are mad that I even want to do it in the first place. which is always the interesting thing to me, because they'll make comments and be like, even the filmmakers don't even care about this that much. Why would you bother? Or these are just movies, man. You shouldn't be thinking about them this hard. No one should be spending this much time thinking about this. And it's just like such a waste of time. And like, I always have the same response. It's just like, I think this is fun, and having fun is never a waste of time. And I know the filmmakers didn't care about it, but I kind of have fun sort of kind of making it up. And it's interesting to me. It's like a hobby.
And we see 3,000 other people, Josh.
Yeah.
You also have 53,000 other people that may agree with you. Just
talk to my 50,000 followers.
That's right.
And if they enjoy hearing me talk about it, then that's all the better. I have to say, with a lot of this stuff, I know I sit there and stare at the screen or whatever like that, but I don't feel like I know more about the rules and laws of these movie universes more than anybody else does. It's certainly not much more than the filmmakers, although I will occasionally disagree with the filmmakers, because a guy from that made Jason Goes to Hell says that that Jason's a deadite, and I'm like, no, he's not. We disagree right there.
No, you're crossing streams. All right, come on now.
Yeah, I mean,
I go too far, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this in a couple of videos before. When people talk about official canon or this is canon or whatever like that, and my joke is that like canon is only canon until another filmmaker steps in and says it's not canon anymore. Because what's canon to Halloween right now is, well, only the first movie counts, and then you've got these three new movies, and that's the canon. And like Michael Myers did this, and Laurie's not his sister. But then you'll get another guy come in there and be like, no, you know what, this counts and this doesn't count. And now canon has switched. So canon is not this like set in stone thing. Even with Star Wars, like people come in and be like, well, we're going to change this aspect and we're going to retcon this or whatever. So canon is always changeable. I mean, in my opinion, if it's changeable for any filmmaker that wants to come in and do this, why can't we change it? Like, if you have your own personal canon, how is that any different than anybody else? So it's like, if your canon is that, like, oh, hey, Exorcist 2 didn't happen, and it's just Exorcist 1 and 3 and then the prequels, and Exorcist 2 is not real. And then someone else is like, no, Exorcist 2 definitely happened, and it's 1, 2, 3. They are a continual storyline. Neither one of you guys is wrong.
Enjoy your canon.
That's right.
Your canon.
Yes.
I'll enjoy my canon. Together, we've got 3 canons.
That's right. To paraphrase Blade, there's always some motherfucker trying to make the last Amity film. Luckily, that's you guys.
And we've got him on the podcast.
That's right. That's right. 80s Project, Josh, you're a few episodes in, and that means every movie is somewhere in that range of like 5 to 10 films. So you've got quite a few movies that when you're done going through the 80s, you'll have watched. Get the book out of it that documents your journey, documents your perspective on some of these films, especially since you'll have perspective having seen them as they've been released through the years, as they've evolved, as they've kind of influenced each other. Because I'm sure you'll start seeing trends and how they impact each other. And then when you get to the 80s, mid 80s too, when you get into all those 3D films, we'll be excited to kind of, dig into some of those, because that's been something that we've been talking about a lot on the podcast. But yeah, man, thank you, Josh. This has been amazing. This is great. Folks should check out your YouTube series, Movie Timelines, the book by McFarlane, upcoming projects, upcoming books. Anything else you want to plug, Josh?
Last Amityville movie coming soon from SRS Cinema, which will be available. I know it'll be available on their site, which is srscinema.com, hopefully on streaming shortly after.
We'll be happy to give a shout out to our followers when it does come out, and how they can access that too. So we'll spread the word on our end.
Absolutely. Thanks, Josh, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, guys.